Making Monsters with Taylor Dahl. It's like beer and brats, a perfect combination.
You know the deal.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Making Monsters. We are continuing on this off-season project where we are breaking down the potential second pick for the Bears into several episodes. I'm calling it the 9th pick and beyond. If they stay at 9, we'll address some of the players that make sense for them to take with that 9th pick. But a lot of people say they may trade down to 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that range. And if that happens, who could they possibly take in that area that would still be worth the value and obviously address a need that they do have, which most people are in the same boat outside of quarterback, because obviously right now, after the trade of Justin Fields, the next quarterback that's on the roster right now is Tyson Bagent. So it looks like Caleb Williams will be the quarterback, but beyond that, wide receiver, edge, and interior offensive line are the 3 biggest needs most people would agree on for the Bears. So we're going to now address that wide receiver position. I think that the Bears did a fantastic job this offseason in building an offense around what, like I said, should be Caleb Williams, and bringing him into a situation that should be pretty comfortable and pretty fun to watch offensively when it comes to DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Cole Kmet, and Gerald Everett both added, in addition to having Khalil Herbert and DeAndre Swift in the running back room. So we're here today to talk about some of these, one of the wide receivers, my personal favorite wide receiver in this draft. So we're talking to Roman Thomashoff, editor for UW Huskies Wire and host of Locked On Huskies. Roman, thanks for joining me again. I feel like we've become really good friends lately.
I was going to say the same thing. It's great to be back. I feel like I just talked to you. I don't know where.
That is hilarious. Yeah, so I will say that when I talked to you the first time, it was mainly to talk about Jaden Daniels. I was doing the quarterbacks. I was to make Michael Penix. I did talk about Jaden Daniels, but not with you. And so we kind of focused on that. We did touch on some of the other players, and you were the one that kind of got me very interested in Rome Odunze. And after we did that podcast, I watched so much Rome film. I talked to person after person about Rome, guys that were at the pro day, guys that were at the combine, and not one person had a negative thing to say about Rome, so much so that I talked to several people who believe they would even take Rome as their number 1 wide receiver in this league, in this draft, which a lot of people, obviously with Marvin Harrison and Nabers, kind of have those 3 somewhere in an order. But I've talked to several people who put Rome at the top, and rightfully so. He's truly become my favorite wide receiver in this. So we're going to talk about him. We know what a monstrosity, what an absolute monster offense Washington had this last season, and there was a ton of weapons. We talked on our last podcast about that offensive line, but in the passing game, it was so much fun to watch, and Rome Odunze was a large part of that. So let's get into it. Tell us about the factor that Odunze was in that offense, even with all of the other pieces that were surrounding him.
So, first of all, I have to say I have made a living turning my friends into Husky fans in one way or another. So I'm so glad to see that it is once again rubbed off on one of my friends. Just absolutely love to hear that. But no, when it comes to Rome Odunze, it's everything you said. He couldn't be a nicer, more wonderful, humble human being off the field. But on the field, he, in my opinion, was the best receiver in the country all season long. He had a special connection with Michael Penix Jr. Obviously, we've seen some of the charts tracking just his success rate on routes and some of those other things where it just seemed like all season long he was uncoverable. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite examples to point to, just not just how good he is, but how strong he is, how tough he is. Everything else about that is when I look at his performance in the first game against Oregon, mm-hmm. where he had 8 catches for 128 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he did that 2 weeks after breaking a rib and puncturing a lung in Washington's win against Arizona. And he's just the kind of guy who played through it all, just continued to fight. He had to take a 24-hour car trip from Tucson, Arizona, all the way to get back to Seattle. And it was a good thing they had the bye week that week. Mm-hmm. But just everything about Rome is just exactly what you'd expect it to be, where he showed up in the biggest moments. He was fantastic all season long. He got better at jump balls where he could have come out in the 2023 draft and probably been a borderline first-round pick somewhere around the Jackson Smith and Jigba, Zay Flowers, Quentin Johnson range. But he comes back, and he's obviously competing against Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Nabers. But Rome is, in my opinion, like you said, the best receiver in the draft for so many of these reasons, where I just love his personality off the field. Couldn't be a nicer human being to talk to. But on the field, he is just such a hard worker. He knows everything he needs to do to get better. Washington's former wide receivers coach, Marcus Shepard, would challenge him where he said, "You're 6'3", 217 pounds. You need to play like it." And he was not necessarily a very good jump ball receiver in 2022. He came back in 2023 and had the best contested catch rate in the country.
Yeah.
Where it didn't matter. He always found a way to get open, even when he was still covered. And Rome is just so fantastic in so many ways. I can't say enough good things about him.
I will melt on draft day if they get him at 9. And I know the draft board looks a little crazy. It looks like Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels. It looks like 3 quarterbacks will go, and Drake May, maybe 4 will go. In some people's mock drafts, depending on if certain teams trade up. I've heard some stuff about Vikings really liking J.J. McCarthy and possibly trading up. So it's going to be wild. And then obviously with Marvin Harrison and with Malik Nabers, it's a possibility that Rome does get to 9, and if he does, I'm just going to be absolutely ecstatic. I know, obviously, I work in Jacksonville, too, and Jags fans have made comments about, if he's there at 17, I was like, he's not going to be there. Rome Odunze is not going to be there at pick 17. You're going to have to trade up above the Bears to get Rome Odunze. But when you look at, because you mentioned that contested catches, and that's something that popped out to me. He had 75% of his contested catches he hauled in this last season. But when you look at him, too, he found success at all levels of the field, too, which I think a lot of times when you look at wide receivers, you look at some of the best ones in the league, and that's why they are the best, because they can be a deep ball threat. They can do the contested catches. They do have that yards after a catch. They can be successful at all levels of the field. And when you drop down to tiers that maybe it's not that top level, it's the guys who are really good at their one thing but maybe struggle in other things, and that is just not Rome Odunze. He can do everything, and on, like I said, at every level of the football field. So, but I do want to ask, how much was the surrounding factors, do you believe, led into his success, or how much of his success led to everything kind of falling into place the way it could last year?
I don't think you can separate one from the other, personally.
Yeah.
Where when you look at just everything that Washington's offense was, it doesn't function without Michael Penix, but it also doesn't function without the offensive line and the receiving core that he had.
Yeah.
Where it all just kind of turned into a perfect storm, which is why all these guys decided to come back, which is why all these guys decided to just, like I said, just do that in unison and go for the national championship. That's why Michael Penix was able to lead the nation in passing yards 2 years in a row, be the runner-up for the Heisman Trophy this past season. It all works so well in sync, and that being said, Rome was still arguably just the key cog of all of that.
Yeah.
Where it didn't hurt that they had a strong running game, where Dylan Johnson ran for 1,100 yards this past season. It didn't hurt that, Jalen Polk also was a 1,000-yard receiver, even with Jalen McMillan missing the better part of 2 months. But Rome was certainly the cog that made it all go, where you would see the field tilt to his side so many times in terms of coverages, and he still was just better.
Yeah.
Because he, for his size, is a fantastic athlete with just all the skills that he's developed just when he's got the ball in his hands, when he's able to just go up and make contested catches, where I know people kind of question his ability after the catch. And there's some shoestring tackles that he's got to get better just a little bit with his balance in terms of just improving on staying up after some contact. But a lot of the questions about, I would say that's the biggest one I've heard about him, can also be attributed to the scheme, where he's just isolated on the sideline so many times, where he's just making these catches, just these tiptoe catches out of bounds and just falling out of bounds towards the sideline anyways. So some of these catches are just going down over the middle of the field and making sliding grabs. So I think that just Rome was such a huge part of Washington's offense. And I would say that he was the most important part, but I wouldn't say that he was the part that kept it all together. It was just all working in perfect unison.
Yeah. And so you're just going through some of his numbers, and this just shows what kind of receiver that Rome Odunze is, because number one, he had 10 games with 100-plus yards, and then another 4 with 80-plus yards. The only game you saw him not notch one of those high numbers was against Arizona, and that was a 64-yard game. No touchdowns in that one, but he had 13 touchdowns this season, and like you said, this is also while Jalen Polk also was able to get 1,000 yards. But, for example, In the game against Michigan State, he had 8 receptions for 180 yards. But then you see other games where, let's see, which game? Utah, 3 receptions, 111 yards, 2 touchdowns. He was averaging 37 yards a reception in that game. So you can see, and that just kind of shows and it factors in how he can do everything, because he can be that big catch guy, but he can also haul in 8 catches a game and still be able to make something big out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Where I think back to that Utah game, and I know I cover the Huskies. I know what I am. He should have had 250 yards and like 7 touchdowns in that game. Like if we're being totally honest, because there were a couple balls that Michael Penix just missed a little bit where he was open. Utah also just has a fantastic defense. They always have. Yeah. They always will under Kyle Whittingham. But Rome was open all day long, and Michael Penix just missed him a couple times. And that's something that happens over the course of the season.
Yeah.
But it's exactly to your point, Taylor, where Rome can have those big games like he did against Michigan State, where he's just pulling in 50-yard bombs from Michael Penix and just still being the number one most reliable target over and over again. And then there are other days where one of the games that I point to is his game against Oregon State, just against another elite defense where there was a whole lot of rain. Some of the other receivers were having trouble with drops. And who was there time and time and time again? That was Rome Odunze. He made the game-winning catch on 3rd down. He had 2 touchdowns in that game. And whenever Washington needed a clutch play, they needed a big play, it always felt like Michael Penix just said, all right, I'm going to look at Rome Odunze. And like in that Oregon game that I mentioned, it was a 2-play drive where Jalen Polk made a fantastic grab. He was another clutch receiver all season long, made a nice grab to start that drive. And then Michael Penix sees Rome Odunze in one-on-one coverage, and he just said, yeah, we could take some time off the clock, but I know we can score right here because I trust my guy to win this ball.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that when you look at the Bears last season, and this is a stat that just absolutely blows my mind, because obviously we knew what a big factor DJ Moore was last season, and he's fantastic. I do think he's a top 10 wide receiver in the league. And he outside of DJ Moore, there was the last receiver to get a touchdown for Chicago last season was Chase Claypool in week 2. And so it's like a wild thing to think about. Obviously Cole Kmet was a factor in that offense, but it was just all DJ Moore in the receiving room. And now we're looking at an offense that could potentially be DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, Cole Kmet, and Gerald Everett, and it just absolutely blows my mind to think about it. But I do want to ask about that. Obviously, I know he was sharing receptions. There were Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan, but how do you think him coming into a room with a guy like, a couple veteran guys and Keenan and DJ Moore, and still wanting to prove himself, but at the same time coming into a room that does have some receivers that will be, kind of top dogs at first?
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I think of Rome, the first thing, no matter how good he is on the football field, no matter what he's doing, I always think of him as just the nicest, most humble kid I've truly ever spoken to. I cannot say enough good things about him off the field. And it's something where he is always going to be a student of the game. He's always going to be somebody who's willing to learn. And he's such a smart kid as well, where I'm sure in an offense with DJ Moore, with Keenan Allen, that he's somebody where, yeah, of course he's going to want the ball, but he knows exactly what he's going to be assigned to do, and he will always do that without any complaints, without any just sort of just – I don't want to use the term diva, because then I just think of Stephon Diggs, and it's just the exact opposite of that, is what Rome Odunze is. So he will just always be somebody who will be willing to accept whatever it is his coaching staff is going to ask him to do.
Yeah, which is obviously what you want to hear. And you would expect that because Keenan Allen is later in his career. I would not expect, honestly, Keenan Allen to be in Chicago past this next year. I think this was kind of a security blanket to come in and have a veteran to help your young quarterback grow and develop in year one, and give him the right ways to be able to develop, because they couldn't do that with Justin Fields. And so when you look at Rome Odunze, if they draft him, he's the future. Like, he is the future receiver of the Chicago Bears, and it's someone we'd be talking about for a long time in Chicago. So it's really fun to think about it in that aspect, that he would be the guy. And when you look, who would be the comp for you for Rome Odunze?
That's really tough. Where it's a fantastic question, because you've seen the Larry Fitzgerald comps, you've seen Devontae Adams, I've seen Keenan Allen as a comp for him. Where I don't necessarily know if there's just one outstanding one, but if I had to be pigeonholed into choosing one, it would probably be Davante Adams, where his long speed is not elite, where he ran a 4.45 40-yard dash. I know he was hand-timed at a 4.34 in the summer before this last season, so we know he can get up to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think when it comes to his route running, his hands, his reliability, and just everything that it is, I think Davante might be the one that I would go with.
Yeah.
But I think that 4, 5, 6 years down the line, everybody's going to be looking for a Rome Odunze, in my opinion.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking at Rome Odunze. I want to talk about a couple of these other wide receivers because I said the hypothetical on the last podcast of, if they go one way for a certain pick, and we talked about Braylon Trice and how, if they do get Rome Odunze, how they could get that edge position later, maybe in someone like Braylon. But then in an opposite perspective, let's say they do get one of those edge guys. I like Jared Verse a lot just because I think that he's a little more versatile. Dallas Turner obviously is a monster when it comes to pass rush, but I like that Verse can set the edge, he can pass rush, he can kind of do a little bit of everything. So let's say they do take a Jared Verse at 9 or trade back a little bit and take Jared Verse at 10, 11, 12, and then they have to address that wide receiver position later. A name that sticks out for a lot of people is Jalen Polk. Tell us a little bit about Jalen. What were his strengths last year? Like you said, another 1,000-yard. What did he end up with? It was over 1,159 yards, 9 touchdowns. So tell us a little bit about Jalen, his strengths, and what type of receiver he is.
Yeah, so Jalen Polk is somebody who I think he can line up all over the formation. His biggest strength by far, by a landslide, is that I think he has the strongest hands in this draft.
Okay.
There are so many just incredible highlights of him where Michigan State is the one I remember where he has to go full extension and just completely lay out. It looks like he's just a table in midair, just pulling a ball in from over his head to pulling like a 38-yard grab from Michael Penix, where he was so reliable time and time again for Washington. But I think that he's somebody where, honestly, when I think about the Bears offense, in the let's just call it 99% certainty that they take Caleb Williams number one overall, which still feels low, that I think Jalen McMillan might be a better fit for their offense.
Really?
Where this is something, and so this is something that I remember talking about with Washington's former wide receivers coach DeMarcus Shepard down at the Sugar Bowl, where he told me that Jalen Polk is going to thrive best in an offense where it's a little bit more in structure, in rhythm, where he can just drop back and throw, where he can just make his one read and go, where he can be a guy who can have 60, 70, 80 catches at the next level. But he just works way better in structure. And then with Jalen McMillan, he's somebody who can thrive in that out of structure, which is his athleticism, his shiftiness. He can line up in the backfield. He can line up in the slot. He can line up outside. He can do all these different things. And he's somebody where if he's on the board in the middle of round 3, I would say, he's somebody I would be a little bit more excited about in the Bears offense, where I love Jalen Polk. Jalen Polk has one of the highest floors in this draft, in my opinion. But I just think with the way that Jalen McMillan can move around the formation and just be utilized a little bit better by a creative offensive coordinator, that he might be a better fit for what the Bears are going to want to do.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that. Where I know last year you mentioned because he had injury, he missed some games right in the middle of the season. What was that injury, and is that something a concern at all moving forward?
No, not at all. It was a knee sprain.
Okay.
And from my understanding, what the matter was, and he missed nearly 2 months with it. But there were a couple of times where it just seemed like he just suffered a minor setback, where it's not a long-term issue, but it was something where it just felt like he tried to rush back from it a couple of times. And it was unfortunate because he tried to come back from the Oregon game after missing a couple of weeks, had a setback, and then tried to do it again a couple of weeks later against Stanford and had another one. So it just took a while to get him ramped back up. And he's somebody who thrives off his shiftiness, off his athleticism. So when it didn't look like he was all the way back, I don't want to say it was a problem, but it just wasn't in his best interest to try to push it.
Yeah.
So Washington just played it a little bit carefully.
Yeah, which I get that. And I think that a lot of times we see it happen every season where, they kind of rush a guy back and then it doesn't work out. And some people start to question. I remember even last year with Justin Fields, because when he had his injury, they didn't put him on IR, but he technically could have been put on IR because he missed 4 games, and everyone was kind of questioning why. And I was like, well, they didn't want to guarantee that he'd have to miss that. They were playing it by ear because you don't want to rush a guy back, especially your quarterback, and then hurt him even more, and then more games end up getting missed, and then you just dig yourself in a deeper hole. But at the same time, there is that balance of understanding that, these guys are competitors, and a lot of times they want to be out on the football field no matter what.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Roman. Well, thank you so much again. I will be absolutely thrilled if Rome Odunze goes to the Bears at 9. We will see how this start kind of happens, or if somebody jumps up and really sees Rome as a weapon they want and trades in front of the Bears and snags him, and I'll cry. But we will see on draft day. It's definitely going to be an interesting one and a fun one for Washington fans because there's so many guys in this draft that you guys are going to be watching going to teams that they'll make almost immediate impact for a long list of guys coming from Washington.
Oh, absolutely. And as a Patriots fan with them holding the 3rd overall pick, I really hope they find a way to get one of these guys on the team, because I will say if any Husky ends up on the Patriots, I'll get that jersey. But if not, if Rome ends up on the Bears, that would probably be the number 1 jersey I'd be looking forward to getting in the background of my own podcast studio.
I love it. What are you thinking they do there? Are you thinking quarterback?
It has to be quarterback.
Yeah.
Where if Drake May is off the board, I'd prefer a trade back personally.
Okay.
But it's Drake May or bust for me at this point, really.
Okay. It's interesting because I've done so many of these lately, and we're kind of, even for helmets and heels, are doing for the Jags a countdown to 17, and we're kind of talking to all the teams that are leading up to the Jags 17th pick and seeing their thoughts, and just to give an idea for the Jags of who could potentially be there at 17. But one of the guys, because obviously I did the pick for the Bears, I was like, it's going to be Caleb Williams. We don't need to spend a segment on this. And the guy that came on next for Washington was like, I'm guessing the Bears selected Caleb. And I said yes. And he goes, well, good, because I want Jaden Daniels anyways. I think Jaden's better than Caleb. And you're starting to hear some of that chat. And I'm like, that's fine. You guys can have Jaden Daniels. Like, I will. That's fine. But it's funny how certain people just feel so extreme about Jaden, about Caleb, about Drake May. You have people who are convinced that each of those 3 could be the best in the next 5 years.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll say this, because I was a day 1 Jaden Daniels truther. I loved watching him at Arizona State. I was so excited about his potential there. I remember when he threw a touchdown pass to beat Brandon Ayuk to beat Oregon in his freshman year. And it's awesome to see how much he's developed since then. That being said, he's not better than Caleb. He's not better than Drake May. Personally, I don't think he's better than Michael Penix, but that's a whole other discussion for a whole other day.
I love it. And it's kind of because I think the critics for both, there's obviously a little bit different things, but a lot of them for Jaden and for Michael Penix, both are like, well, of course they were good because they had great offensive lines and they had a million weapons. Like, who wouldn't be good in those offenses? And so it's always an interesting argument to me. And I'm like, okay, so you're arguing that because someone has good weapons that they weren't good. I don't understand.
It's such a frustrating argument. And then I point people to, hey, just remember, Michael Penix threw for 500 yards against Ohio State at Indiana. So that's why I like to go with that.
I love it. Well, Roman, again, thanks so much. Hopefully that it would be nice if maybe both of us are cheering for Washington Huskies on our teams next year. But I appreciate you hopping on with me again. Like I said, it's going to be a fun draft day.
Taylor, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Alrighty, guys, now we're continuing on with the wide receivers episode, or I guess weapons episode, when it comes to who the Bears could select. There's a lot of back and forth, and we've mentioned this now this is my 2nd episode of this series, and so we've talked about it a little bit. Edge, wide receiver, interior, offensive line are the 3 main things that a lot of people are looking at for the Bears. But I think when we talk about wide receivers, there's 3 names we talk a whole lot about, and we've been talking a whole lot about, and that's been Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Nabers, and Rome Odunze. So we're going to move on. We just talked a lot about Rome, who I've mentioned is my favorite. I love Rome. I've fallen in love with Rome, but I completely understand where everyone stands with both MHJ and Malik Nabers. So we're joined by today Zack Nagy. He is the publisher for LSU Country on Sports Illustrated, and that is for LSU football, recruiting, basketball, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So Zack, thanks so much for hopping on with me.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you for having me. And I love Malik Nabers, so this is kind of the perfect subject line for me.
I love this. I'm excited. So And there's a few ways we can go. There's obviously another wide receiver we'll talk about with LSU too, but Malik Nabers is fantastic, and we'll also get to the fact that some people even have him as the number one wide receiver over Marvin Harrison Jr. But each of his 3 seasons, I feel like you just progressively saw him get better each year, and some of that there's multiple reasons. I think number one, Kayshon Boutte, kind of what happened with his career at LSU, the arrival of Jalen Daniels, and I think in just his progress in general, and the way that LSU's offense really started to thrive, especially the last couple years. But let's start 2021. He played in 11 games, 417 yards, 4 touchdowns. So that was kind of the start of what you were beginning to see what he could be already that early in his freshman season. But tell us a little bit about that first year and what you guys were seeing right away out of Malik Nabers.
Yeah, so Malik Nabers was a guy who was offered late in the recruiting process. This was a guy who was committed elsewhere in the SEC before kind of decommitting, reopening his process, and then coming to LSU. So by no means was he a late bloomer per se, but he certainly wasn't a guy that was on LSU's radar for the entire high school career. So ultimately got offered by LSU and reopened his process immediately, knew that this was kind of the place that he wanted to be. And then fast forward, like you said, to his freshman campaign. And this is a guy who is just one of the most explosive football players that you've seen in a while. And you see a lot of draft analysts, obviously now, talking about his explosiveness, but you saw a glimpse of that as a true freshman as well. And he burst onto the scene towards the final, let's say, 2-3 games of his true freshman campaign. And it was really reminiscent to somebody like Kayshon Boutte, who really did the exact same thing when he was a true freshman. But kind of just sticking on the subject of Malik, man, he burst onto the scene super, super abruptly at the end of the year, and obviously carried that into his sophomore campaign as well. But this is a guy who's just a tremendous athlete, and he showcased that on several occasions as a freshman.
Was there a little concern for Tigers fans just because the way they saw Kayshon and the rise and fall kind of quickly happened that would happen with Nabers, or did you guys believe that it would easily carry on beyond that first season?
I think when you're looking, obviously, different quarterbacks, different situations and stuff like that, I think Kayshon Boutte's a special athlete, but there were different instances off the field and just different situations for both players. For Malik specifically, I don't think that was ever a worry. I know he's had his one issue in the past, but it's not that big of a deal. And I think you've seen him grow as a player. His character has developed so much over these last couple of years. But to answer that, no, I wouldn't say that there was really any, let's say, concern for him off the field.
Yeah, and if we jump over to his sophomore season, you immediately saw the jump, and I feel like Tigers fans probably took a deep sigh of relief of like, okay, this guy is going to be maybe even better than they thought he was that first year. He had 18 straight games with a reception at one point, and I can't remember exactly where that started and finished, but he had over 1,000 yards. He broke 1,000 yards that year. There was only 3 touchdowns, though. So tell me offensively what was going on at LSU with him in the red zone, why that touchdowns weren't there, but the yardage was.
I think, as a sophomore, it was such an interesting year for this LSU team as a whole because Jayden Daniels wasn't necessarily this deep threat quarterback at the time. There were a bunch of concerns that he wasn't utilizing his weapons in the appropriate way, and it kind of started with somebody like Malik Nabers, who is a physical, just explosive guy downfield, and he reaches the ball at its highest point, and he's so incredible in the red zone. And Jayden Daniels was, I don't want to use the word scared, but he was extremely timid when it came to fitting the ball in tight windows. And obviously we saw that evolve this year. But, during Malik's sophomore year, sticking to that, there were instances where he was, let's say, somewhat open downfield, and Jayden just wouldn't trust his arm and push it into those tight windows. And I think that affected Malik's numbers from a touchdown perspective. But they immediately developed a connection both on and off the field throughout that season, referring to both Jayden and Malik. And I really think that carried into the junior season. But yeah, if you're looking at that 3 touchdowns, it's a very small number, absolutely. And I think that you could kind of point in the direction of Jayden not necessarily throwing it into tight windows and being relatively timid when it came to going downfield.
Where do you think a part of that progress was Brian Kelly? Because it's interesting to me because I'm a Notre Dame fan, so I had Brian Kelly and coaching my organization for a long time, and I just felt like the offense never at Notre Dame was what you wanted it to. It was a lot of the run game and a lot of defense that you counted on, but it almost felt like when Brian Kelly went to LSU and what he was able to develop, and Jayden Daniels and some of these wide receivers was really fun to watch. So how much do you think that played into it?
I think it's a completely different scheme, and not even just scheme, just different athletes, different everything. It's a whole different world in the SEC at times. And I think when he came down to LSU, I know a lot of people like to talk about the talent that's down here in the Bayou State, but it really shows on a routine basis. And somebody like Malik, who's a Louisiana guy, I think everything changed for Brian Kelly. I think he had to rely on different things when he was up at Notre Dame. And then you come back down to Louisiana and you're in the SEC and you're routinely having a top 5 recruiting class and you're just getting different players consistently. And for Malik, it was and I'm just kind of sticking on Malik because I know that's who we're sitting here talking about. But he's a guy who developed extremely well within this system, and putting the two together, Brian Kelly brought a really good staff down here and he had really good players. And I think that was a recipe for offensive success because Joe Sloan's an incredible quarterbacks coach. Cortez Hankton is an incredible wide receivers coach. And they both just got promotions to co-offensive coordinator positions. So I think just an all-star staff mixed with all-star players, including Malik Nabers, was a recipe for success in the SEC for Brian Kelly. And it's kind of just a whole different world.
Yeah, we definitely know that the offense had to make up for a lot of the defensive problems this last season, especially in LSU. But when you talk about, and that's why I was like, don't worry, guys. We talked about that 3 touchdowns. But this last season, watching Malik Nabers was watching LSU's offense. It was one of the most explosive, most fun, that just moved down the field so easily. But over 1,500 yards, 14 touchdowns. What aspects of Malik Nabers' game would you say grew the most within those 3 years?
Comfortability. I think really he had a different quarterback, obviously, in his sophomore campaign as compared to his freshman season. And I think just comfortability, familiarity, and really growing as a leader on and off the field was something that allowed him to become a better player on the field. Obviously, his physical traits were always something that we knew were going to be there. We knew that was always going to be the case. He's explosive, he's fast, he's twitchy, he's fun to watch. But I think there were different things that he needed to do in order for it to all come together. Because you can be a superior athlete, but not a superior leader and a superior person off the field, and it can kind of hurt you. But once you put both those together, you're unstoppable. And I think we saw him put both those things together during his junior season with Jalen Daniels as well. And I think, like I said with Brian Kelly, I think putting those things together for Malik was really a recipe for success. We saw him be explosive, fast, physical, fun to watch, putting his entire game together. And I think that 14 touchdowns and 1,500 plus yards is kind of a product of him putting it both together, his physical traits and, the mental aspect of football as well.
Now, if you were making the argument for a team, if you were in that scouting room and you were making the argument for a team to pick, whether it be Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Nabers, what would be your argument to skew people towards Malik?
See, I know that you just said you're a Notre Dame fan, so and I know they're independent. I don't want to pull the whole conference card on other people that are listening, but my argument would certainly be that Malik Nabers was competing against the best of the best on a routine basis in the SEC, and I didn't go to an SEC school, so I'm not SEC biased by any means. So this isn't me just saying this just out of pure bias. This is me basically saying this out of watching the development of Malik Nabers and watching him do it against different cornerbacks. Whether it was double team, different coverages, you put the best corner, your second best corner, whatever you threw at Malik, there was no answer for him. He was just unstoppable. He was an unstoppable force, each and every game. So my argument for Marvin Harrison versus Malik Nabers would certainly be just, I think Malik is the most explosive player in the draft, one, and B, the proof is in the product. I mean, his numbers were absolutely astounding throughout SEC play. And of course, he had Jalen Daniels, a Heisman winning quarterback, and Marvin Harrison didn't have a Heisman winning quarterback. But at the end of the day, I think Malik Nabers played a pivotal role in Jalen Daniels ultimately winning that Heisman based off his production on the field. They were 2 peas in a pod, and I think it showed in both of their numbers. So that's my argument. I know some people might not like it, but I truly believe that, you put somebody like Malik Nabers up against the best of the best in the SEC, and, his numbers showed.
Yeah, and I think the SEC, obviously, I live in Jacksonville, Florida. All I hear is about the SEC, so I believe that. I hear that argument a lot. It is interesting because this year I've done a lot of I've done a lot of podcasts on potential picks, and I still have several to come up. And the amount of Pac-12 guys that I'm covering this offseason has been wild. Like today, I was like, okay, here is Washington, here is UCLA, here is all of these teams that I'm like, wow, it's kind of crazy to cover this many Pac-12 guys, but it kind of shows obviously that is going away. So we'll see how kind of the college football world, and I'm sure that's a hot topic for you guys a lot of times too, of what the format will look like. They're talking about the Super League and what potentially that could look like. That's a whole different topic. But if you're wondering, if people didn't watch a whole lot of LSU football and you're wondering why this offense was so high-powered and so fun and so explosive, you can look at two guys, and that's what I want to shift over to one of these other, and Brian Thomas Jr. And we can talk about Jaden Daniels and how well Jaden Daniels, how much he progressed, how comfortable he got, and you just mentioned all of those, the moments of him throwing in tight pockets and things like that just steadily got better through his time in college. But 31 touchdowns between Brian Thomas and Malik Nabers, which is insane. And Malik Nabers almost 1,200 yards himself, and that's on top of sharing these receptions and sharing the touchdowns with someone like Malik Nabers. So share your thoughts on Brian Thomas and his role on that offense.
Anybody who knows me knows that I am a Brian Thomas stan. Like I love what Brian Thomas brings to any team that he's on. Obviously, specifically LSU at this point in time. I've loved his game ever since I started covering the team, and I truly believe that this is going to be, I would have said a steal a couple of months ago, but now he's obviously flying into this top 20, realm, and I don't see him falling past 20 in the draft. So if you were to ask me what I think of Brian Thomas, this is a physical specimen. This is a guy who can reach the ball at its highest point. His vertical is outstanding. His hands are strong. He can do anything that you ask him, whether it's crossing routes, deep routes, screens, whatever you really need him to do. He's a jack of all trades. And at the end of the day, there's also a guy who hasn't been playing football for very long. Yeah. He's a late bloomer. He was a basketball guy. He was really one of the top players in Louisiana on the hardwood. So now he's kind of translating that basketball success from an athleticism perspective and really putting it together on the football field. So this is a guy who really, you give him the proper situation and the proper coaching, I mean, he can burst onto the scene super quickly in the NFL. We saw him put it all together in his junior season with LSU, and I firmly believe that was kind of just the appetizer of what this guy's truly going to be. So I think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be a steal for anybody that gets him anywhere. I know that he's not going to be a top 5 guy, top 8 guy, but as you keep looking down the line, whoever gets him is going to get a superstar athlete who's just bursting onto the scene. So I'm really high on Brian Thomas Jr., and I don't want to do more of a monologue because I could talk about him all day.
I love it though. And it's funny because I do this podcast for the Bears, but I also host a show called Helmets and Heels that is in Jacksonville. So they cover the Jaguars. The Jaguars there's been a lot of people mocking Brian Thomas to the Jags. I've been very vocal about do not let him slide past that. If he makes it to 17, take him at 17. Because I agree with you. I think he's just one of those guys, especially when it comes to a lot of the factors. He's that big guy receiver. And for a team to have somebody like that, especially like the Jags there, Christian Kirk is just not that guy. Christian Kirk is kind of more of that inside slot guy. He can make those big catches. He has hands, but you need that big guy on the outside that you can count on certain situations like that. Another example of major production increase, because same with kind of how I had Malik Nabers, each year you saw yardage get up, you saw just the ability for them to do certain things increase each of those 3 seasons. So the same kind of what I asked for you of Malik Nabers, what did you see in Brian Thomas grow to this point this last season where we're seeing him have 17 touchdowns?
The best word that I would use again, and I know I use it for Malik, so I don't really want to try to use the same one for both, but it's really going to be comfortability. I really watched somebody like Brian Thomas Jr. get more comfortable on the football field, and it showed. Because like I said, he didn't really start getting super into football until roughly his junior season of high school. So he's really been playing football for, let's say, 4 or 5 years. So I think the more that he got comfortable in the scheme, the system, more comfortable with wide receivers coach Cortez Hankton, I think, again, it was kind of like a byproduct of really just what he's all about. And the more he got comfortable in the scheme, the more reps that he got with Jaden Daniels, more Jaden Daniels pushing the ball down the field. I really think it allowed Brian Thomas's game to open up in a bunch of different ways because he's a physical receiver and he's a great vertical threat. And I think the more that Jaden Daniels pulled away from being timid and truly trusting his arm, I think it allowed players just like both Malik and Brian Thomas Jr. to explode. And like you said, 31 touchdowns combined. I mean, wow. It's remarkable between both of them. So you have a big 3 of Jaden, Malik, and Brian Thomas Jr., and they both kind of spearheaded LSU to the number 1 offense in the country.
Yeah. So answer me this. Where would you say that Brian Thomas, what type of offense he fits best in? I ask this because in Chicago, obviously looking like Caleb Williams is going to be the new quarterback for the Bears. They have DJ Moore. DJ Moore's been fantastic this last season. They just added Keenan Allen. They already have Cole Kmet, and they added Gerald Everett this last season. The run game's already pretty strong. DeAndre Swift and Khalil Herbert there. So it's kind of seems like he'd wiggle his way into a room that I wouldn't say is crowded, but it is somewhere where he has this experience of sharing it. So do you think he would fit in an offense like that?
Yes. My short answer would be absolutely, solely because I I'm going to keep, I feel like I'm just detailing this over and over again, but Brian Thomas is fresh on the football scene. So he's going to need some time to adapt to that new NFL speed. And I truly believe that if he goes into a system that already has a true wide receiver 1 and even a wide receiver 2, the more that he can kind of get more reps under his belt as kind of a backup per se, I think it's going to be the type of thing where he pans out long term. I know the Patrick Mahomes method is one that a lot of people like to talk about, where you sit for some time and you get comfortable in the system and then you take over. I don't think Brian Thomas necessarily needs a whole year to sit back and wait, but I think learning from savvy vets is going to be something that helps him a lot long term. And I really think no matter what system he goes to, he's going to shine. But having a savvy vet to kind of lead him along the way is going to be a true key to him being successful at the next level.
That's what's going to be interesting about the Bears draft this year, because like I said, it seems like they're leaning towards Caleb Williams at 1. Then they have that 9th pick, which a lot of people are saying if a Rome Odunze or Malik Nabers are there, can't pass that up. Got to take one of those guys at 9. But if one of those aren't there, maybe a trade back to 12, 13, 14, and you'd be able to get a guy like Brian Thomas Jr., who, like you said, you feel like is fitting in an offense. And you do have a couple of wide receivers there, a 1 and a 2 at this moment. But Keenan Allen later in his career, it may be that perfect kind of bridge for someone like Brian Thomas to be that third guy, but behind Keenan Allen, who is going into year 11 and probably isn't going to be around much longer, but also I feel like does have a similar playing style when it comes to the strengths of both of them. I do want to talk a little bit about the personalities of these two, because it is a big thing. For me personally, Making Monsters is all about getting to know these guys about beyond X's and O's. But one thing we've really learned about Ryan Poles, the GM for the Bears, is he is a big, what type of guy is this type of person. He wants these to be good people. They passed on Jalen Carter last year because some of the issues, off the field issues, and Ryan Poles doesn't like to deal with that type of stuff. I haven't heard a whole lot. I will say that during the combine, and you tell me your thoughts on this and your experiences, I did hear at the combine that some people were a little critical of Nabers. They said he was mocking somebody in the building, and they couldn't really tell if he was joking around or if he just kind of has that personality. So tell me a little bit about Malik Nabers and his person and Brian Thomas' personality.
Yeah, I think sticking with Malik first, obviously this is kind of the perfect time to talk about it, solely because you saw those reports come out a couple days ago about being high maintenance and whatnot. And my experience with Malik is nothing of the sort. We've had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him quite a few times. And it's funny because obviously Malik and Brian, and I'll get to Brian in a second, but they're polar opposites.
Okay.
Malik is the type of guy who is extremely boisterous and loud and fun to be around, and just a Louisiana guy. Like, he just acts like it. He has that Louisiana swagger, and he carries himself as such. And not to say that Brian Thomas doesn't have that, but Brian Thomas is certainly a little bit, quieter than somebody like Malik Nabers. He's quiet, he's to himself, but sticking on one at a time, we'll talk about Malik first. He's a guy who's just loud, fun to be around, and plays music loud. And that's why him and Jaden were so just like a match made in heaven, because Jaden's just this cool, calm, collected guy, and Malik's a pretty cool guy too. So it's just it was always fun to kind of watch them two just do things together. He'll wear his big chains, wears cool shoes, cool clothes, just is a really cool guy, and he's really fun, and he's really evolved as a person over the last couple of years that I've gotten to cover him. He's gotten, the word wouldn't be media trained, but the word would be he's just gotten absolutely more mature. And of course that happens when you're in college. You just become a more mature guy. And we've seen that happen with Malik. So
when you're 18 years old, I always hear come on, I don't know. I know how I was when I was 18.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think you got to understand at the same time that these are quote unquote kids. And obviously they're going to evolve through college and grow and mature. And I think we saw that firsthand with somebody like Malik Nabers, but just a fun guy, loud guy, cool to talk to. And kind of going towards Brian Thomas, he's a quiet guy. Every time we've gotten a chance to talk to him, he's very quiet to himself. Isn't going to be the one who kind of is like a loudmouth at a party. He's going to be kind of to himself. And we've only gotten to talk to him a couple of times, but every time we've gotten to talk to him, it was a really good conversation. But he's a super calm, collected to himself guy. So whatever situation he's going to, they're getting a guy that's just an all-around good person. And I'm intrigued to see where they go, obviously.
What about Jaden? This episode's not on Jaden. It's about the receivers, obviously. But there's been a lot of talk, and Jaden slowly moved his way up the boards, too. A lot of people have him as QB2. I even have heard a few people say QB1, honestly, that they draft him over Caleb Williams. We've heard the chatter that the Bears should take Jaden over Caleb. So I don't think that's happening. But your thoughts on Jayden Daniels, and like for the people who may say that he excelled because he had these two guys and not because he is Jayden Daniels.
Yeah, I think Jayden Daniels is kind of just scratching the surface as a football player. I know Caleb Williams is obviously Chicago's guy. I think the whole world knows that. But Jayden Daniels, there's no argument between the two. My overall perspective on Jayden is just a guy who's scratching the surface right now.
Okay.
He's really starting to come into his own as a quarterback. He's growing into this pocket passer now. We saw him in his first season in Baton Rouge. He was sporadic at times. He would only go through his first read and then kind of just duck his head down and run. And now he's starting to evolve in the sense of going through all of his progressions, trusting the deep ball, trusting the tight windows, not being as timid. And so I really think that if he goes into the proper situation, whether it's Washington or New England, wherever it really is, I think that whatever situation he's going into, I think that coaching staff is getting a player who has the chance to be a super special player. And I know that's kind of a vague statement saying super special, but truly, like, it's a Heisman winning quarterback, of course, but I do believe that he has the potential to become a talented quarterback in the NFL because his deep ball is one of the prettiest in college, and I think it's going to translate really well to the NFL. And again, not trying to be biased here, but I do believe that Jayden Daniels has an opportunity to be extremely special in whatever situation he goes into next season.
Look, Zach, I have been all over the place this offseason. I was one of the people that was pro keep Justin Fields. I wanted to roll with Justin Fields. I think that the progress we saw throughout the years,
I'm with you for that matter.
Thank you. Especially in the situations he was given the last few years. I felt like we're seeing the offense be what he needed to do. But I just don't know how any quarterback can succeed when they're getting sacked 100 times. So that was a big issue for me. But once I got that news that Justin Fields had been traded and it was time to move on, and I really dove into some of these other quarterbacks, including Caleb Williams, I was like, okay, here's another chance for the Bears to prove themselves and again, which we'll see, obviously, that it's just such a big question mark when you're drafting guys. And I will say, though, he's being put in a really good situation. The offensive line is better. I just mentioned all the weapons he has. The defense has gotten a ton better the last couple seasons. So it's probably one of the better situations because let's be reminded that the Bears don't have the number one pick because they sucked. The Bears have the number one pick because of the Panthers. So it's a great situation for Caleb, or if it was Jayden or whoever would be coming into a great situation. But like you said, it does look like it's Caleb Williams. I have one back. Now I have a little like speed round, like fire question for you. So I'm going to go through these list of words, and I want you to tell me which of those two receivers, whether it's Malik Nabers or Brian Thomas Jr., relate most to the words that I say.
Cool.
And it may be both. I know sometimes like both of them may be good, but whichever one you think is strongest with this particular thing. So let's start with number one, yak yards.
Malik.
Okay. So Malik is the guy that and we've seen this a lot. And if you haven't, again, watched LSU football, because I know a lot of people maybe not went in depth with LSU football, but he was that guy that if he's catching any pass and he's getting some sort of yardage after he catches the ball.
He's just so explosive. He can catch the ball off a screen, a crossing route, whatever you need. He gets the ball and he's gone. And I think the proof's in the product. The numbers don't lie. So Malik on that one for sure.
Now, for this one, we talk about two different types of speed in the NFL, and for receivers, multiple, I guess, types of speed. But this one, what about burst speed? I'm
going to go with Brian Thomas just because his 40 time was so impressive.
Okay. And it's funny, I talked to someone when I was doing my Jayden Daniels episode, and I asked that he was talking about, I want to say he was talking about Brian Thomas. Yes, he was talking about Brian Thomas Jr., and he was talking about their different speed. And he said one he explained as fast and one he explained as quick. And he's like, I know that sounds like the same thing, and so that brings me to my next word when it just comes to quickness.
Malik.
Okay. Now what about route running?
Malik is just so crisp and he's evolved so much as a route runner. I know it's a speed round, so I'll just say Malik.
Okay. Contested catch.
Brian Thomas.
Okay. And then a big one because this could go either way, but red zone.
Brian Thomas. I think the touchdown numbers speak for themselves there.
Yeah. And so obviously when you go through this list of things, Zach, it's everything that you want out of a wide receiver, and you're getting them from both of them in aspects, but there obviously are things that each of them are better at. So I do think that if you do have one of those top 10 picks and you're able to get Malik Nabers, fantastic. Congratulations, because I think he's going to be amazing. But if you don't, and you're getting a Brian Thomas mid-round a little later in the round, I think you're just as lucky.
Yeah, I certainly I would never want to call Brian Thomas a consolation prize by any means necessary, but look, if you can't get Malik and you can get somebody like Brian right below him, you're getting one of the best players in the draft and truly a potential top 3 overall receiver in this draft. I know there's that top 5 and the top 3 are kind of similar in the sense, but I'd put Brian Thomas in the mix with all of them. I think he's going to be super special.
Now, Zach, what are you guys going to do this year? No Jaden, no Malik, no Brian Thomas. What is this offense looking like for the Tigers?
I wouldn't say it's looking the same, obviously, because you're losing a Heisman-winning quarterback and 2 first-round receivers. But you're putting Garrett Nussmeier into the mix here, and he's looked super crisp during spring camp. I've been really impressed with what I've seen from him, and he's been a vocal leader. He's been waiting his time, and so I truthfully believe that now that it is his time, he's not taking it lightly, and he's hit the ground running here in this locker room, on the field. He's kind of checking all the boxes that you want from a quarterback, and we're sitting here talking about wide receivers, so I'm just going to sit here and harp on the wide receiver room here. It's deep. Kyron Lacey's a guy who's coming in here and looking very competitive during spring ball. You can really insert Kyron Lacey and Chris Hilton as 2 of your starting wide receivers, and then you have 4 or 5 guys competing for that 3rd spot, specifically Alabama transfer before Aaron Anderson, Liberty transfer CJ Daniels, Mississippi State transfer Xavier Thomas, and then redshirt freshman Kyle Parker. So I know these are a lot of names that are not familiar with a lot of fans of college football right now, but I can assure you in the coming months, these are going to be guys that people are going to be very familiar with, specifically Kyron Lacey and Chris Hilton if they can stay healthy. But the offense is going to be clicking. I'm extremely intrigued to see what they can do because they certainly have the weapons. But I think offensively you're going to have a very competitive team, and then defensively, once again, it's a work in progress.
Yeah,
it's a work in progress. You're going to get a couple more guys to the transfer portal over the next couple of weeks during the spring window, and from there, the summer is going to be about developing continuity and developing rotations. And fall camp's going to tell the story out in August, but the offense is going to be clicking on all cylinders, and the defense is going to be where you're kind of going to have to work around a couple of different rough edges in order to get to that sweet spot.
It'll definitely be an interesting year in college football because we mentioned just the wide receivers leaving LSU, but then the wide receiver depth in the draft this year is fantastic. We're still talking about potentially getting a really good receiver in the 3rd round this year, and usually it's not like that. So that just shows the amount of wide receivers that are leaving college football. Obviously the quarterbacks, because we're talking about Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams and Drake May and Michael Penix and Bo Nix and JJ McCarthy and all of these guys leaving too. So there's going to be a big shift, but I guess the positive thing now is the transfer portal, because these guys, they have this, they're accessible to be able to go to schools and it kind of help that school compete quicker than maybe they would have been able to in the past. I've been trying, so it's funny because my cousin, he works at a marina in the Panhandle. I've been trying to get him to get some information for me because Brian Kelly parks his catamaran at his marina, and so I'm always like, just go have some conversations for me, get some insight. But anyway, Zach, thanks so much for hopping on with me. I really appreciate it. And again, I would be thrilled if whether it's the Bears or the Jags, honestly, get one of these LSU wide receivers. So I appreciate you chatting with me about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for letting me hop on. This was really fun, and whoever they get, they're getting a true gem if it's either one of those guys.
Love it. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Thank you, you too.
All right, we are continuing on now with Making Monsters. It is our off-season project of who the Bears could potentially take with that 9th pick or beyond. We're focused in on weapons right now, and who better to join us than Mike Griffith. He covers Georgia Bulldogs for Dog Nation. Mike, thanks so much for hopping on with me.
You bet.
All right, so we've talked plenty of Bulldogs, Mike, especially this last few seasons, but this year is an interesting one for us. We're about to talk tight end Brock Bowers. Now, the Bears have Cole Kmet, who just signed a new contract this last offseason. They just got Gerald Everett, they just got this last free agency. So it doesn't really seem like tight end is a need for them specifically, but Brock Bowers is a different type of talent, and I think that's definitely worth talking about. So let's start from the beginning. Right out the gates, Bowers had 882 yards, 13 touchdowns. Tell us about that first year and really what you saw right away from Brock.
Well, he's explosive. You know, he's got deceptive breakaway speed, and that's just not something that you necessarily equate with the position. You know, he catches a screen pass that most tight ends take 12 yards, and he can take it 65. His ability to run after the catch is It was really fantastic. Again, game-breaking speed, almost like Tony Gonzalez in the open field when you think of throwbacks. And listen, I remember Cole Kmet. Cole came into Georgia one year, and Notre Dame almost beat Georgia here, Sanford Stadium in 2019. Kmet was really impressive, and I expected bigger results. But it's tougher to separate in the NFL, and I think what Brock has that Cole doesn't have is that quickness and the ability to separate and get open. He's got an incredible catch radius and body control. Again, it's just you don't see a guy with this fluid. He is a dual threat tight end. He can block, but you're not drafting him to block. I think the Bears may run a lot of double tight end sets.
Yeah.
That may be why you would say that, well, gosh, you better have 3 tight ends then, right?
Yeah.
And plus, you can do things, as you alluded to. Brock's the guy that lines up in the slot. He lined up at running back. I mean, you can create a lot of matchups with him because smaller players that are fast enough for him, he can overpower or block in the run game. You look at the matchup. And then if you put a bigger guy on him, they're going to have a hard time keeping up with him. So he's a multi-talented guy. He produces like nobody else. I think he was the key to – I think if you were going to ask me who the most indispensable offensive player was during Georgia's 2 national title seasons, I would tell you it was Brock Bowers.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, and that's why with the 9th pick, there's Bears fans, Bears media that are glaring that, looking at Brock Bowers at that potential 9, or even maybe trading back a couple spots and trying to snag him there. But you mentioned a good point when it comes to the Bears offense and what they could run. They just added Shane Waldron as the offensive coordinator, who ran the 4th highest 2 tight end sets in the league when he was in Seattle. And then he also likes to set up a lot of play action using multiple tight ends too. So I think that's why a lot of people are kind of looking at this. When you look over, Mike, when you jump up to 2022, 942 yards, 7 touchdowns. Plus, like you mentioned, he did have another 109 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. So offensively, for maybe the people that weren't full on watching Georgia during that time, or maybe focused in on Brock Bowers, how were they using him that season to create all of those rushing opportunities, in addition for him to still be able to notch those 1,000 yards?
Yeah, a lot of jet sweeps.
Okay.
Again, we talk about his speed and his ability to, run after the catch. And Todd Monken was the offensive coordinator, and a couple things that worked there. One, Brock was able to pick up the system extremely fast. Really, for a freshman, you typically don't pick up the playbook that quickly, much less at the tight end position, which is probably one of the most difficult to transition into because of all the responsibilities and knowledge. So this is a really smart guy that picks up football quickly, multi-talented guy that creates matchup problems, has the speed to run the jet sweep, as you noted. And Monken did a really nice job with him. And then, last year Brock was off to another dominant start. He was playing with Carson Beck, who's a little bit more of an NFL arm talent than Stetson. And not for Brock, they probably wouldn't have won at Auburn. He's just the kind of guy that can take over games. And he got injured last year.
Yeah.
Georgia probably would have won another national title if Brock Bowers hadn't been injured. As it was, he played at less than 100% against Alabama, and of course Alabama has a lot of first-round projected players, and even Brock at 75%, you're not going to beat first-round corners.
Yeah.
And he wasn't as effective in the SEC championship game, and so again, he was the most integral part of the Georgia offense, the most irreplaceable part. I'm not going to see another guy like this for a while in college football.
How much do you factor in for these guys that are heading to the NFL that have played in the SEC and have played against this high-tier talent that, like you said, you're constantly seeing all of these Alabama guys, even Florida, when they're down, you're still seeing players produce and kind of get into come into the NFL. So when you're looking at the SEC as a whole, how much do you believe it prepares them a little extra for the NFL?
Well, Georgia's had 34 guys drafted over the last 3 years, which is more than any program, and they had 15 drafted after 2021. Their 2021 team had 5 eventual first-round picks, and, of course, I'm sure Chicago fans are shaking their head at letting Jalen Carter get away because, boy, he's a monster, and that would have been a really good pick last year. But the fact of the matter is when you compete against better talent every day, the bar's set higher. There's an expectation, and one thing that teams know when they draft Georgia players is, one, they come from a championship culture, and, they understand what it takes to win championships, and they understand how to work for championships. Another thing that, I can speak for Georgia on this as well, their best players play special teams. And, when you're drafting that guy in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, you want a guy that's going to contribute on special teams if he's not going to be a starter. So at the SEC, though, the level of competition is, you can take a look. Historically, there's been more players drafted out of the league than any other league in the nation. Now, I think Ohio State and Michigan have a standard that's on par with that. But for the most part, maybe Penn State a little bit. But for the most part, the Big Ten schools don't produce as many, and they don't have the depth of talent that the SEC, no other conference has, right? So I think there's something to be said for that. But you can only go so far. This is on a case-by-case basis. We were talking about Polk. He's a Notre Dame guy. He could have played anywhere in the SEC or Big Ten. So it's not like that's the only place you can get great players. But yes, there is a different level of competition, maybe week in and week out, from top to the very bottom, I would say. But I wouldn't go hog wild over that and just draft exclusively from any one league.
Yeah, I think this year's a good example of that. The amount of players that, as I've been doing these podcasts, have been Pac-12 guys, honestly, a ton of them. And that just shows kind of what they were able to do and their farewell tour with the Pac-12. But I know tight end, when we're talking about Brock Bowers, he did not participate in his pro day. He was a no-go due to a hamstring injury. I think actually today it was scheduled for them to kind of hold something, a workout for NFL teams, and I believe that was today. But do you what do you see from that when it comes to injury? His injury obviously this last season, and now this hamstring, are those totally different types of injuries?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
He had the tightrope surgery on his ankle, and then you mentioned the hamstring injury when he was training. And the thing is, this is a guy that wants to compete. This is a guy that wanted to work out. He stayed out at the advisement of his agent, and he was awful edgy. I wrote a story about that. You could just tell he was just he doesn't like to be on the sideline. He's a competitor, and I don't think it's a serious injury, but I do think it's, something that, was smart for him to wait. Yeah. And I'm sure he'll run a good number. I would say he'd probably run a low 4.4 would be my guess.
Okay.
And he should test out pretty well. I don't think there's going to be any red flags there.
We love to hear that. Let's move on. I want to ask you about one other guy before I let you go, because as I'm doing this, talking about weapons, and we address a lot of the ones that could potentially come early with that 9th pick, but there are potential trade downs. There are obviously picks a little later in the draft. So I want to chat about Ladd McConkey. He caught people's eyes, especially this offseason when he's getting ready, preparing for the draft, ran a 4.39 40. Tell us a little bit about him. What type of receiver is he? Where do you think he fits best on an offense?
He's explosive. He's really fast coming off the line of scrimmage. He's really slippery. Ladd's got great acceleration. I think that, he kind of reminds me of, those New England Patriots slot guys that were just impossible to stay on top of, and Brady was able to find him in the dark. And Ladd's got really good hands. He's a tough guy. He's a competitor. He had a back injury at the start of the year, but, I think that worked itself out, and that didn't flare back up. But he was another guy that was slowed at the end of last year by an ankle. He came back out against Florida State and, looked pretty dominant. But Ladd's a good player. I think this is a guy that's got the look of a long-term NFL veteran. But like Brock Bowers, he's one of these squeaky clean guys. You're not going to find any issues he's ever been involved in. He's the guy that's going to be the Boy Scout leader someday, and you want him to marry your daughter kind of guy. These are both really, these are both really high character guys, and it does translate. So they're leaders. They're locker room guys. They're hardworking guys. I put Ladd with Brock in terms of, the explosivity. The difference is Brock was a tight end. Ladd, some people might look at his size at 6 foot, 190, 195 is a little small, but, you get up close on him and you see, he's, his lower body is really thick, and he's gotten bigger as he's come. He's kind of the storybook walk-on guy that, only had one scholarship offer and red-shirted. It took him time to get built up and get bigger, stronger, and faster. I think he's got and I say this, and I know it's a dangerous comparison, but he's got like a McCaffrey-like quickness to him. You watch Christian McCaffrey, and he just looks like he's, one notch higher on the video game quickness level, and that's Ladd. Now he's not not as powerful as Christian yet, but he can run through some tackles. So poor man's Christian McCaffrey, maybe, I don't know, better receiver, but I think he's an impact player in the NFL. I really do.
I love that, and he's a name that you kind of see in a broad range of draft boards. Some people have him going as early as the first, late first, and some have him a little later. So he is a guy that I think that it is maybe somebody focusing on who has that second round, mid second round pick that they definitely need a wide receiver as a move. Do you see him as someone who would be able to plug and play in an NFL offense almost right away?
Oh yeah,
okay,
for sure. Yeah, and I think part of the reason why you see such a high fluctuation is it's a really deep draft for receivers.
Definitely.
There could be as many as 6 taken in the first round. Mm-hmm. And is Ladd one of the top 6? Again, it depends on team needs. Adonai Mitchell's the guy that was here, for a couple of years and won a couple of national titles. To me, he looks like one of the great players on the board. And, of course, there's Marvin Harrison Jr. and, the Washington receiver. There's a long list of receivers, and different teams have different needs. And, all it takes is one team to like a guy. And if a team likes Ladd and wants that quickness off the line of scrimmage and that, speed after the catch and, those hands and that toughness, or do they want, a guy like A.D. Mitchell that, is going to go up and get the jump ball and, he's going to run that fly at 4.34. I mean, different kind of receiver. So just like we were started out the interview, we were talking about different kinds of tight ends. I think there's different kinds of receivers too, and so I think it depends on the team and the need. But I think there's a possibility Ladd could go in the first round, but certainly no later than midway through the second.
Yeah, and like you just said, if you took out Marvin Harrison, Nabers, and Odunze, who seem to be those top 3 for a lot of people, you still have a list that includes Brian Thomas, Adonai Mitchell, Ladd McConkey, Troy Franklin, Roman Wilson. Pearsall we've seen kind of risen up recently. And so these are all wide receivers. So if you took those first 3 out, and even in a normal draft, we'd still be looking at some wide receivers that people would be really excited to see on their football team. So that is, when you talk about that wide receiver depth this year, it's honestly really fun. And especially if you're a team that is in need of a wide receiver, lots of choices. Final one for you, Mike, before I let you go, because it is looking like it seems like this is going to be the choice the Bears make in drafting Caleb Williams with that first pick, a new quarterback after now parting ways with Justin Fields, who obviously you're a little bit familiar with also. So thoughts on what you have seen of Caleb and some of the expectations of him at the next level?
Well, I mean, from a talent perspective, I don't have many questions at all. But there's more to playing quarterback than talent, and that's where I have questions. And we've seen a lot of talented guys that have come in the league and not had success, right? And then we've seen other guys who maybe didn't win championships in college, like C.J. Stroud came out just really killed it last year. I was so impressed and happy for him. And when you know his story and what he's been through, and he's the Ohio State guy that never beat Michigan, didn't really have a title, and success story. Again, these NFL GMs and scouts, they get paid a lot of money to psychoanalyze these guys, and I guess if they think that some of Caleb Williams' off-field traits aren't going to be an issue, then by all means, But does he strike me as a guy that's going to turn around a franchise? I don't know that he has the right attitude for that. I don't know that I think it's going to take a really special guy at that position, and it's going to take a good fit. You saw Justin Fields, a lot of skills, a lot of things he could do well, but I don't know during his tenure how often he was really in an offense, that maximized his skill set. So I think this is a better question for the offensive coordinator and the style of offense that he wants to run, the type of quarterback he wants to manage, and how close are the Bears? Are they just a quarterback away? I mean, I don't really know that, and and if they're not, how would Caleb Williams handle losing? How would he handle the responsibility of people coming to him and putting it on him, even if it wasn't all him? I thought for the most part Justin Fields handled that about as well as he could.
Yeah.
It's tough. I mean, it's a tough sports town. I actually spent a lot of my childhood up there in Waukegan. I know all about the the Bears and
Mm-hmm.
the Cubs and the Whites. I get it, and they're hungry and they want to win, and it's been a bit of a spell. So there's you got the number. If you're going to bring this guy in, there's going to be incredible pressure
Definitely.
for him to produce right away. And what do they say? Adversity doesn't build character; it reveals it.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll find out a lot about Caleb Williams if he's the guy.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Mike, I was very pro keep Justin Fields for the most of the majority of this offseason. Once they traded Fields, obviously my job is to move on and get to know the next guy. And try not to have that emotion attached to it. But it was hard because I agree with you. I just don't think he was ever put in the best possible spot. And I do believe that Caleb is. So expectations not only for drafting someone first is already high, but then now you're coming into an offense with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and Cole Kmet and probably another wide receiver with that number 9 pick and a run game and a defense that's been built pretty well. So expectations are going to be pretty high, and we had seen some.
Wow.
Yeah, we've seen some.
Strike up the 85 Bears. I'm ready for the season.
Let's go. I know. It'll be interesting, and we saw some moments of weakness when it came to Caleb not shaking hands and leaving press conferences and the crying in the stands with his mom, those type of moments. And like you said, Chicago will eat people alive in certain situations like that if you're not winning football games. So like you said, I think we'll see pretty quickly. It will probably be revealed really fast. But obviously, for the sake of us, a team that's been an organization that's been looking for a quarterback for a really long time, I hope it does work out. But I really appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, and I listen. I appreciate the Chicago Bears. I like what they stand for. I'm a Midwesterner myself. People pull themselves up by their own bootstraps around there, and I think that fans, respect players that do their best and work hard, even when things are tough. I think the Bears fans are out there, knowing what this team and this NFL franchise was built on. I mean, this is a lunch pail city, and they want a lunch pail team, and And I can tell you that Brock Bowers brings the lunch pail. The quarterback discussion, we could have it forever. But guys like Lad McConkey and Brock Bowers, those were two cornerstone guys at Georgia that played huge roles. And I'll look forward to watching the Bears. I hope that franchise has some success. I think it's I don't want to say overdue, but
yeah.
I grew up watching that team win. I grew up watching that team win a lot of games. So.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll see a turnaround this year.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I will say also I cheer very hard for Carson Beck. I'm a Mandarin High School alumni, so we have that relation there here in Jacksonville.
Wow,
so
now it comes out. Now I know you're a Beck guy. Where's he going to go next year?
I know. That's why even this year there was a little bit of chatter that he may enter the NFL draft, and I was like, that's such an interesting discussion. But I knew for him it'd probably be best to go back. So it'll be fun to watch him this year. I'm excited.
Yeah. Yep, I'm with you on that.
Thanks so much, Mike, and I'll chat with you soon. I hope you have a good rest of your week.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye-bye.